morons make such a big deal out of me not coming to these things on time. Then I show up 2 minutes early, and you idiots spend the first 8 minutes of us just sitting here blathering on about God knows what. And if you just let me come when I'm normally come, which is 10 to 15 minutes after you start, then we would be right on time and I could avoid all of this. So in the future, either let's just start when I get here. How about that? And then you guys can revolve around my schedule. Okay. So when I get here, we start.
So audience, I hit record just before Justin went on that tirade, so you could see how he treats us when we're not on air.
Yep.
So today we're going to be talking about Earth Day 2020, Planet of the Humans, and our renewable energies green on episode 240 of the In the Tank podcast. Of course, as always, I'm your host, Donald Kendal, and Justin, you were live for that. So editorial director, that's how you treat us? Anything to say for yourself?
Look, yeah, you know what? I do have something to say for myself.
Do you want to walk any of that
and
back?
It's this. No, actually, I don't want to walk any of it back. Here's what I want to say to the public. Listen, public, if you had to deal with these guys off the air, you would understand. You would, in fact, celebrate the fact that I toned it down.
Also joining us, we have Isaac Orr, policy fellow at the Center of the American Experiment. How are you, good sir?
I'm great.
Awesome. No response to Justin's tirade there?
Justin just talks to hear himself talk. It's the same old Justin.
And Jim Lakely, VP of Heartland Institute. How are you, good sir?
I'm doing great. I was just actually shocked that Justin did not drop a couple F-bombs and some other profanity in there. I was waiting for it. It didn't happen. I admire your restraint, Justin.
Wait, earlier we established that nobody actually listens to the podcast. So I think that we should be able to drop whatever we want to drop.
That's a good point.
I move to allow the F-bomb on
Yeah, Jim teased us with a Guardian email that suggested that they listened to this podcast to later find out that it was a different podcast that they were listening to, so he teased us. But for the record, we did reach a monthly high of downloads for this podcast last month. So we're doing something right.
How many was it?
17. Anyways, so we're going to be... No, I'm just kidding. So Earth Day. Earth Day was this past Wednesday. So
it was?
Forget about coronavirus. Talked about that for 6 weeks in a row. I'm sure we're going to be talking about it the next 6 weeks in a row. So forget about all that. Let's talk about some Earth Day stuff. So in a surprise move, Isaac sends an email to us all saying, hey, let's record and talk about all these Earth Day things. I'm like, oh, great, sweet. I didn't have to look for topics to discuss. Yeah, let's do what Isaac said. One of those things was a link to Michael Moore's newest documentary called Planet of the Humans, which came out in July of 2019. But they just put it up on YouTube for free for people that want to check it out the day before Earth Day. So they put it out on Tuesday. So I watched that at length this morning. I thought I was going to watch maybe the first 15 minutes, maybe the last 15 minutes. But once I started getting into it, I watched the entire thing. And I encouraged everyone else on this podcast to do the same, because I thought it was worthy to dedicate maybe the entire episode, if not a substantial chunk of the episode, talking about this thing. So this premiered at the Traverse City Film Festival in July of 2019. Like I said, they released it. They released it on YouTube on Tuesday. And just reading off some of the reviews that people were putting in the comment section on the YouTube channel, I marked a couple of them down. So, quote, probably the most depressing film I've ever seen. This completely reframed the entire environmental movement. This has to be the sickest, scariest, and saddest documentary I've ever seen. It does not give me much hope for anything good to come on this planet. So again, context. This was put on Michael Moore's YouTube channel. So we can get into it in length. I'll give my basic review, and then we'll get into some details. But my basic review is that this is something that I feel like you can send to anybody that is concerned about climate change, thinks that we need wind and solar to save the planet, or whatever. because this is coming from a lefty. This is a documentary that was done by people like Michael Moore.
Mr. Lefty.
Mr. Lefty himself. So I thought that for the most part, it was great and filled with a lot of fantastic content that we talk about on this podcast regularly. 10% of it was some of the worst stuff that we rail against as well. So generally speaking, I give this thumbs up, but the deeper meaning behind this, which, spoiler alert, is a very anti-human message, is my least favorite parts about this whole thing. So, Isaac, you sent this to my attention. We actually talked about this a little bit because the main guy behind it, Jeff Gibbs, he had like a couple of quotes back, whatever, where he was saying like the closer he looked into green energy, the worse it seemed. So we actually talked about those articles several months ago. I don't know. So we're familiar with this, but you kind of, dredged it back up and told us to watch it because it was out on YouTube. So you watched it first out of all of this. So what were your basic reactions?
Yeah, I guess for me, it was kind of a holy cow. This is Michael Moore. And I kind of knew that was going to be the case going into this because, I've read reviews from the Traverse City thing saying that, oh, yeah, this really pulls the veil back on the environmental movement and is a pretty, damning criticism of the renewable industry. And, it's interesting because everybody thinks that wind and solar are this consequence-free energy that's just perfect, right? I mean, basically, nobody thinks of them as having downsides. But this review or this documentary did a really good job of just ticking off all the downsides to it. Like at one point in Vermont, there's a scene where they're leveling the top of a mountain so they can put wind turbines on it. And they're calling it like mountaintop removal for wind turbines. And, that's the same criticism that people had in Kentucky of like mountaintop removal for mining. So like this is an industrial process. And the worst part about it is, like, I'm sure we'll talk about this, is it's not even an efficient industrial process. Like It's the least efficient way that you can try to generate electricity. So, all these people that think, oh, we just need to go back to nature are really advocating for us to do really stupid things.
Yeah, absolutely. And Justin, you, I believe, are the only one of the four that has not watched this. I think you've seen a couple of clips here and there. So at any point, just feel free to jump in as just kind of the person reacting to this and ask us questions about all of this. But Jim, I thought that this documentary, again, based on those articles that we talked about months ago, I thought that I was going to turn this on and it was going to be an hour and 20 minutes of coal is bad, natural gas is bad, nuclear is bad, fossil fuels are terrible, and then 15 minutes at the end of, well, wind and solar isn't great either.
It's not perfect, but it's the best alternative we have. Yeah.
That's exactly what I was expecting it to be. So when I turned it on, and the first hour was just destroying wind and solar, just wrecking shop. I was shocked. Did you have a similar reaction to that?
I did. I couldn't really actually believe what I was watching. I found it fascinating because, the green weenies that the Heartland Institute and our friends have been opposing for all these years, they could have learned all of this stuff. They could have learned all of this about the folly of wind and solar and the need for fossil fuel backups of every single plant and the mining of, child labor mining that is necessary to get the elements needed to make batteries and solar panels and all of that stuff. They could have learned all of this years ago, coming to Heartland's climate conferences, reading the Heartland Institute's website. So when we say it's a problem and the media calls us, crazy, the leftist media says that we don't know what we're talking about. But I guess when yeah, right. But I guess when an apocalyptic environmentalist like the director, Jeff Gibbs, says it, now they're going to listen to it. So fine, but credit should go where credit's due. Heartland and Isaac Orr and the Center on the American Experiment and other outfits, CFACT and CEI and others that have been talking about this for more than a decade, maybe 2 decades. We should get credit for that. But I was also struck that, man, the environmentalists that he would interview out on the street, especially college campuses, what a bunch of and then the green granola eating guys up in Vermont and all that stuff. I mean, these people are idiots, and they're really kind of freaks. They don't know what they're talking about. I think it's wonderful. One of my favorite scenes was when they went to Vermont near the home of Bill McKibben, who's another fraud from 350.org. And they go and alluding to what Isaac had talked about, where they clear off the top of a mountain to put up 24 wind turbines. And this is just as bad as coal mining and destroying mountains for that as well. And none of these people had any idea this is going on. Of course it's going on. I mean, I had to also laugh. RFK Jr., who's another mental lightweight. They had a clip of him saying, once you build our solar plant, it's free energy forever.
Yeah.
What a moron. That's not it. That's not it at all. And the fact that the mainstream media and our culture has been, wafting up morons like RFK and frauds like Bill McKibben as the leaders of the environmental movement. It's just amazing. And really one of my other takeaways is that, in the beginning, Donald, as it was going on, they showed clips of Obama, giving everybody hope. And there was all this hope that all this environmental stuff was going to, all of our environmental dreams are going to come true. And, through every environmental promise that was made back then has fallen through because it's not sustainable. You can't do it. And all that proved to me is that environmentalists are really cheap dates. You could just lie to them and they will give you their devotion forever and never really wake up, except this guy, the director, Jeff Gibbs. His eyes are actually open now, and he may be coming from the extreme left, but at least he's looking at this honestly. It's the most honest environmental and energy documentary in the quote unquote mainstream I think we've ever seen. And it's got 1 million views on YouTube already, by the way, from the left. Yes, of course, from the left. We have great documentaries on our side, but there's been 1 million views on YouTube in just 2 days already. That's probably better than if this was released in theaters. I think it's fantastic.
Right. So the director and the narrator of this is Jeff Gibbs, who was a producer on like Bowling for Columbine and Fahrenheit 9/11, like other Michael Moore films. So it was kind of like a flip-flop of the roles in this. Michael Moore was the executive producer for this and not the narrator and director. So the first 5 or so minutes, maybe 10 minutes, is just dedicated to Jeff Gibbs establishing himself as like a name that you should trust when it comes to him talking about these things. Obviously very concerned about the environment, very concerned about climate change, was a big supporter of some of these renewable energy things. He did writing on various websites about all this, blah, 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 blah. So that was like the first 10 minutes. And then the first sign of like a disillusionment starts off when he goes to like a green energy festival. And it's just like a bunch of like people singing and people are selling like solar panels or whatever.
Yeah, freaking hippies.
And then it starts raining. And he says that
basically Woodstock.
Once it starts raining, he sees a bunch of people behind the stage like scrambling around. So he takes his camera and he goes back there and he says, what's going on here? They're like, well, it's raining, so we're not getting all the solar energy that we thought we were going to be able to get. So we're plugging into the electric grid.
Well, first it was a diesel generator. They claimed it was biodiesel, but who knows, right? And then it's like, oh, well, still not getting enough juice.
Yeah,
that concert out there isn't going to get powered by the sun. We need to plug into the grid. It was beautiful.
Yeah, and then it's like goes to like the next scene is them going to like this rollout of like the electric cars. I don't know, it's like the Chevy Volt or something.
Yeah,
whatever. So there's this big press conference and there's like pictures are being taken and all of this stuff. And then he asks, like, what's the energy being used? Like it's charged, it's being plugged into something like some federal building or whatever, some state building. And the people acknowledge that it's plugged into the grid, where 95% of that is coming from coal. So again, it's just like these little examples of like this mirage, this illusion that we've got green energy and all of that. But just taking a little look, just a small look under the hood. And it shows that it's, just as bad as anything else in their minds. Right?
Yeah, it was really the Wizard of Oz moment. The curtain literally got pulled to the side, and you see what's really going on back there.
So I have a question for you guys. I obviously, as Donnie pointed out earlier, I haven't actually watched it. I do plan to watch it. It sounds delightful.
Yeah, you're gonna love it. It's gonna be shot.
It sounds like I'm gonna love it because this is the kind of stuff that I am particularly interested in. I don't care that much about the science of climate change relative to these kinds of arguments. These are the sorts of things I like more than anything else. So my question is, what if they start with the premise of climate change is going to destroy the world and we're all going to die and it's an existential threat to humanity and blah, 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 then what is the like, what is their solution? If
Oh,
they
we'll
if
get
they
to
knock down like all these things, then
Don't
they
answer
must
them.
have something.
Don't answer
Okay.
them. We'll get to that.
So I have
That's
I have a
coming
second.
later.
I have a second
Okay.
question then. All right, if you guys are gonna like kick that can down the road, and
Saving
that
it.
question is, do they talk to? Because you would think that one of the advantages to making this as Michael Moore or Gibbs and these kinds of people is that they could get interviews. Like if I went out and made this, I wouldn't be able to talk to Bill McKibben or whatever. He wouldn't talk to me, but they would talk to them,
Rightfully
right? So did they talk to those people? Number one, and number two, what did they say about that kind of stuff?
Jim, you seem to be chomping at the bit. Oh, or Isaac, feel free, take it.
Go, Isaac.
Yes, they did indeed meet with Mr. McKibben and some of these other folk. I don't think that they got Al Gore to agree to it, but let's just say that Mr. McKibben was not very enthusiastic to talk to Mr. Gibbs.
Yeah. So that comes into another section about biomass that we can get into, but that comes a little bit later. But
the cool thing about this is that it just called all of those people hypocrites. They just, I mean, it was a point blank like shot to the face. Birdshot, Dick Cheney style.
But what did they say?
McKibben.
But what did they say? That's the
this.
thing. Like, what was their explanation? How did they even try to dance out of it?
So that also comes a little bit later. So we can get into that in a little bit. But it is a very harsh look at the Sierra Clubs of the world, the 350.orgs of the world, the Al Gores of the world,
Defense Council. Yeah.
Bill McKibben comes out looking horrible in this documentary, but again, that kind of comes in the second half of this.
I took a note. He was there's a clip of Bill McKibben being interviewed by a journalist, I think from Britain, and they were she said, well, who funds you? And he's like, well, I don't know. She's like, what do you mean you don't know?
Yeah.
But when his first answer to that, it's like, how are you funded? And he says, not very well. Yeah. Hilarious. I actually looked up their 990 form. They raised $19 million in their last form in 2018. If that's not funded very well, I want to be funded half as not very well as that.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so the first half of this, there's another piece that I titled Disillusionment, where he's like talking to this gentleman that runs like a solar farm out in the middle of some town. I'm not sure what town it is, but it's a pretty decent sized solar farm, not massive by any means, but pretty decent size. And he starts like explaining, or he's asked like, how many homes is this like solar farm able to power? And he's like, well, what we like to say is that we have enough capacity to run 60 homes on this solar panel array.
Peak capacity or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
So then somebody's like, well, what does that mean? And he's like, well, we don't ever reach peak capacity. And if you look at the numbers of what we were able to generate, this, pretty decent sized solar array can power about 10 homes. And they just kind of look around, and there's just like hundreds of homes and buildings sitting around the solar array. So it was just like one after another of just explaining how like the stuff that we say all the time, that wind and solar are terribly inefficient ways of producing energy for the world.
I'm sorry, and I just wanted to add one other note. And he had to admit, or he seemed very eager to admit, that the solar panels were only 8% efficient.
Yeah.
Like he's like, these are not the ones like if we were NASA, I mean, this, if we were sending something to Mars and to be able to power that, we have a lot more efficient solar cells. This is 8% efficiency, which means it's a complete piece of garbage.
Yeah.
Right.
And those solar cells were like $1 million an inch.
Yes. Yeah. $1 million.
I think the thing that's always lost in this, and I know that when I was first looking into a lot of this, Isaac actually was one of the first people to mention some of this stuff to me specifically, but all these studies, all these things that promote the benefits of these things, even though we look at those things and we say, well, all these studies, all of these things that have been done that supposedly show the benefits economically of this, jobs created, all of that, there's all sorts of reasons why you really can't trust those numbers. But the biggest thing is actually that they're all based on they are building these solar panels and these wind turbines in the most ideal locations that they possibly can right now. And even with that, they're having all these issues and problems. And it's one of those things where they're gonna use all these numbers, which a lot of them are bogus anyway, to tout how great these things are. And then we're only going to find out that none of this works even remotely close to as well as they promised after we've built all of them and they're not working. Like, that's their plan. I mean, it's not even like we don't know that, like they're just ignorant. They know that. I mean, the people who actually build these things, like they know that, you know, building a solar panel in the middle of the desert is going to turn out a lot better than it would in, you know, wherever in Minnesota or something. They know that, but it's actually significantly, like exponentially worse than anything that they tell us now. And to the point where I actually don't think we can know the answer. It's so much worse than what in reality it would be, but there's so many variables that we can't take into account that I really don't think we even know how bad it would actually be. It would just, all we know is that it would be exponentially worse than what they're telling us. We don't know how much exponentially worse it would be. I mean, it really is incredible when you think of it like that.
Yeah, you know, it's so then the next part of this documentary just kind of goes into the production of wind and solar. So it runs through like a bunch of just like clips that you would probably have seen in like a grade school type what is renewable energy videos, where it's like solar panels are just made out of sand, silica, right? Just sand. And there's just shows like deserts just full of sand. And then they start asking some experts about like the reality of that. And it turns out that's not the case. What they need is like, and I'm probably going to get this wrong, but quartz or something.
Yes. They need very high quality quartz, which is mined in North Carolina. And the funny thing is, like, they have this pile of quartz. It's like, we got to melt this quartz, and we have to melt it into this glass. So he's like, in order to do that, you need coal. So he sets down this like big chunk of coal right next to it. He's like, well, actually, you need a lot of coal. So he puts down another one. So it's like 1 part quartz, 2 parts coal.
Yeah.
And it's just like sitting there. And by God, is it glorious.
Right. And then they cut to another guy talking about how like solar panels only last sometimes maybe 10 years and need to be replaced. And then they cut to another part talking about the mountaintop removal thing to put like the wind, you know, turbines in. So it's just like this absolutely environmentally devastating process to get what is considered green energy. And okay, Jim, one second. I'll go to you. But I think that this is where like the film, which it does a good job, it really tries to pull at the heartstrings here. But this is where it was a little bit lacking to me, because like we just did multiple reports on the environmentally, you know, ramifications, the environmental ramifications of pursuing something like the Green New Deal. And you could dedicate entire shows to just how much environmental consequences would result from just having a fraction of that. And it was only reserved to like a 15-minute segment just talking about it. But go ahead, Jim.
Well, it was funny. They had that, if you remember that, about halfway through the film, they had a musical interlude with this, scary music and showing in fast motion all of the heavy equipment that's doing all this mining and throwing up all the different chemicals and rare earth minerals that have to be pulled out of the ground to make things like solar panels and wind turbines and all the other batteries and all the other stuff. I mean, that was fun. It's as if this guy got red pilled. I mean, he has been in the environmental movement from the left his entire life. That's, again, a good description, Donald. The first 10 minutes are basically establishing for the audience his environmental bona fides, because there is hell coming after that. He has to set that up, or else people wouldn't take him as seriously as they should. Right. Because he's telling the truth about this, about what a scam green energy is. And people should not get the idea that this is, really from the Heartland Institute's free market libertarian perspective. No, it is anti-capitalism to the extreme.
Absolutely.
And so they don't care about the economic costs. Yes. And there's a bit of a death cultish tone to it too, because it's very anti-human. So and
the first hint towards that Because again, I talked to Justin like 45 minutes into it, and so far it was just wind and solar is bad. Wind and solar is bad. The first hint of it came within that 45 minutes, and it was talking about how like a lot of these green energy facilities or whatever have ties to like the Koch brothers, which he described as like the devils themselves or whatever.
That's exactly what he said. That's the quote.
Yeah. So it's like, if he was really red-pilled, you would think he would have been over that idea. So that was the first hint that like this guy wasn't completely on the level when it came to all of these topics, but that gets absolutely proven in the second half of this. But the biomass stuff was some of the most shocking stuff, because biomass, in terms of like the way that government qualifies green energy or whatever, renewable energy, like biomass is included in that. So you get these biomass plants that literally just cut down trees and burn them for energy. They get these like government grants, which is amazing. And then it starts showing like a bunch of just examples of how like Sierra Club was in favor of biomass, maybe not necessarily now. They play like at length like a speech by Bill McKibben talking about how like biomass is like the future and how we should be doing this all over the world to save the planet. But then it just goes through what the actual process is. And like, you know, like you would think it just kind of paints this idea that like, oh, just pick up scrap wood in the forest and throw it in a thing and create energy. Like who could be against that? But then it just shows like just leveling like forests and just cutting them all down and then burning them for like the worst possible way to generate energy seemingly. And then it goes even further. And they're talking about like this town that's like downwind from one of these biomass facilities. And they notice that like in the winter, there's like a layer of like soot on their snow. So they test it out and they find out that it was rubber residue. So then they discover that at some of these biomass places, to get the fire hot enough to actually burn like moist wood, they have to throw like rubber pellets in there.
Yeah,
so
tire chunks. It's awesome.
They're burning rubber. It's like we're going backwards in time. Like,
oh my God,
it's insane.
I have to say this though: have any of you guys ever burned a tire before? Like,
no.
In real life, tire fire.
No.
Oh my God, it is awesome. So
here to elaborate.
Yeah. So I was at a field party like several years ago. And for all of you city folk who don't know, sometimes those country people just go to a field, build a fire, and drink alcohol.
This isn't Somalia. Go ahead.
Yeah, Somalia, Wisconsin. It's in Wapaka County. You jerk, Donnie. No. This is in a little place called Manawa, Wisconsin. It was like a Halloween field party we went to, and they had this fire. And then all of a sudden, this guy walks over, and he throws a big old tire on there. And I was like, oh no, that's bad. That's not good for the environment at all. And then like, because I was like not in favor of this, but then all of a sudden it just goes and this like wave of heat just radiates off of it and it gets super bright. And I was like, oh man, that's cool. So like,
okay. Well, you and Bill McKibben are like on the same page apparently on this one, because again, they show like all of this footage of different, I don't know, organizations that are like promoting this idea that, oh yeah, we just turned to biofuel, which makes us green and all of that. And then just like juxtaposing that against the reality of what biomass is. And it's pretty amazing. They actually start going through, and this is where that clip that Jim was talking about, where like Bill McKibben was like really didn't want to talk with anybody. They start like kind of going to some of the different activists and groups and saying like, well, what do you talk about? Like, you know, what's your stance on biomass? And I forget exactly how like Bill McKibben like tried to like, he did not want to talk. He was trying to get like off camera basically. Mm-hmm. And then everyone else was just either just trying to like talk in loops around it. They were indifferent towards it, not really sure, but not against it, which was pretty shocking to me. But
well,
yeah,
he was trying to run away from the question, you know, but they had shown the clip earlier, which was definitely from earlier than that interview on the street at a Earth Day rally or some kind of march in New York City, that he was all for biomass. He was like talking about how great it is. And he couldn't, you know, he was talking about it in such glowing terms. We're just going to have these trees and just going to feed these trees in this plant. We need to do this all over the country. And then when he's confronted about that, he pretends he never said those things or doesn't remember saying those things. And he tried to run away from it. And in the end credits, they do mention that he is now against biomass, I suppose. Or, the day after this premiered, he says, "Oh, no, I don't like biomass." Because one of the things about biomass is it just gets looped in for all this, so-called renewable energy. And, technically that's true. Trees are crops and, they do grow back, but not in the industrial scale that it seems to be used, at least portrayed in this film, for energy use. And one of the fascinating things there, people talk about they're worried about the Amazon rainforest being cut down, right? And we think it's mainly for farmland, and maybe it is. But North America, Canada, the United States, we ship trees and we ship wood to Europe to use in their biomass plants. Brazil ships trees to be burned in biomass plants in Europe, and so does Indonesia. And these are places where people are really concerned about deforestation, and it's all in service of so-called green energy. How about we just burn natural gas? Why don't we just do that? It doesn't hurt any trees, or coal for that matter. It doesn't hurt any trees.
Yeah.
There's a few things here. I thought it was interesting. They said that you'd have to burn every tree in the United States to supply 1 year's worth of energy, which is pretty incredible, right? When you think about how much energy we use, right? And then also the scientist that they were talking to, the guy who puts all the coal on the thing next to the quartz, he even says at one point, like, we might as well just burn the coal and stop pretending like all these solar panels are doing anything to reduce emissions. And that was a money shot. I couldn't have wanted anything more than that.
Yeah. Right. And they kind of go into that. They're saying you would think that the more renewable, quote unquote, energy that we put up there, the less of these conventional fossil fuels or whatever that would be used. But how they were saying that's not the case. And when you actually try to scale up these wind and solar, you actually require more fossil fuels just to either get them off the ground or any of the other things that revolve around, getting these. And that, again, that's kind of another thing that I thought that they could have went a little bit further on. So at one point they're talking about one of the engineers that's overseeing putting up one of these giant wind turbines, and he's starting to explain just the weight and how big these things are and how it's made out of fiberglass or whatever. And I thought we were going to start seeing some of those shots of how basically that these only last about 20 years, they can't be recycled, and they're just buried after their livelihood is out, right? And they never really got to that. So, I mean, again, I think that they could have just went a little bit further with some of this. I'm sure I'm asking too much because this is only an hour and a half documentary or whatever. But it's just stuff that we talk about on this podcast all the time.
Yeah.
You can't recycle any of that. It's just trash. They just bury it.
Yeah, I mean, one of my, I'm going to say favorite scenes, and I almost started to feel sorry for these hippies in Vermont who are climbing up to the top of the mountain and watching it being clear cut to put up wind turbines. And, one guy there was an energy expert, and he says, yeah, this is for nothing because you have to have a natural gas plant to back this up when the wind doesn't blow, because you have to keep the grid stable. It's wow, we've only talked about that for 15 years. And, that's just what every reasonable and knowledgeable energy person knows. And the listeners of this podcast have known this for quite a while. And then they actually they were almost crying, look at all these trees, look at this mountain being leveled off so they can have stable ground to put these huge wind turbines in here, and it's only going to last for 20 years. And then it's going to be useless. It's going to be, it's not going to be. So all of this destruction, environmental destruction on the top of this mountain is going to be for nothing in 20 years. And then they actually showed, he showed on screen, basically a whole farm, or at least a row of wind turbines that are rusted out and just sitting there. And, that's what's going to happen all across the country very soon if we were to all go to scale up wind like the greenies say we have to.
Yeah, and then all of this, again, is in the context of 3% of the energy production in the United States is wind and solar, maybe even less than that. So that doesn't even go into, and again, this is another thing, maybe a shortcoming, maybe I'm asking for too much, but just the environmental ramifications if we tried to go 100% wind and solar. So Justin, if you can find those reports, we did 2 different reports at Heartland Institute, policy briefs, on just what the environmental consequences would be if we pursued the Green New Deal. And maybe you can find some of those numbers of how large scale we'd have to build this out. That would be great. But while you're finding that, and this is right after my conversation ended with Justin, and I went back to watching the documentary, It's when the turn happened. Okay. So the first half of this was just dedicated to just how terrible wind and solar was, how bad biomass was. And then it starts to talk about how, and I wrote down this quote, the real problem is that we have too many humans using too much stuff. That's when I thought, okay, this is going to take a turn. This is going to take a very bleak turn. So they start talking about how the rate of human population growth was and how it took us 50,000 years to get to like 700 million. And then as soon as we found fossil fuels to exploit, it just skyrocketed. Like, this is the real hockey stick chart, right? And the elbow of that chart, when we start really trending upwards, is when we figured out how to use fossil fuels, apparently. And that's when I started to get really, really worried about the direction of this. And, starts basically saying like how the only way forward, the only potential of this increase is a massive collapse of society and how this is all unsustainable. So, I mean, Isaac, did you have the same type of reaction to me when it's like the first half of this was just amazing and then the second half starts to take a really anti-human turn?
Oh, I was giddy during the first half. I was like, this is going to trigger so many libs and it's going to be awesome. Because at one point they show this town in California. I forget the name of it, but it was like the epicenter of the solar boom back in the 70s. And now like it's all completely just ghost town. Like there's nothing in the storefronts. And they talk about how like the industry was good for a while, but now it's like an old coal mining boom town that the lefties on the coast like to make fun of for like West Virginia. But that's what happened to this place. So it's like, oh yeah, so you're like your Green New Deal with all those great jobs. That's what this is going to turn into.
Right.
But they go to this place that was the biggest solar field in the world when it was built. And all the panels were like gone. Like they didn't even ever announced that they were getting rid of all of them. And it was just like completely devastated. And they called it a solar dead zone. And oh my God, that was amazing.
And they had to clear out all of this like natural desert life and all of these like
Yep.
Yeah, when they cut down those 500-year-old Joshua trees and just chipped them. Oh my God.
Yep.
So they could put up these things.
So good.
So that they could just take them down like 15 years later.
A point we've been making on this podcast a lot over the years is that people have this, this really pops the bubble that people think that green energy is free, that not just, it's just free from the sun and the wind, but that there is no environmental cost to green energy. And this really hammers home the point of how untrue that is. And that frankly, for efficiency's sake and for many reasons, using fossil fuels to power our economy and our lives is so much better than using these solar and wind on a scale that's it's not even a close call. It's not even a close call.
But yeah, so getting back to Donnie's point, I thought it was really interesting. At about an hour and 30 minutes into this, the prevailing theme was humans must accept that infinite growth on a finite planet is suicide.
Mm-hmm.
We must learn to do more with less. It's not the CO2 molecule that's destroying the planet, Donald. It's us.
Yeah. It says it's not fossil fuels that are destroying the planet. It's us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If we get ourselves under control, all things are possible. Which, again, kind of when they're talking about the population growth, all I can think of is population control, which is terrifying to me.
Yeah.
Well, ultimately, that's what it boils down to. Because at one point, they're talking about industrial agriculture, and they say that it's subsidized by oil. So you can't go back from that. And the expert or whoever the heck they are, like interviewing in there, even says that. He says you can't go back without a massive depopulation event.
Yeah.
And, that's why, like, I sent the guys when I was preparing everyone for the show and doing all the work because Donnie didn't want to. I sent everyone a tweet from Extinction Rebellion, which is like the group of really crazy people over in the UK. But they said something along the lines of coronavirus is the cure and humans are the disease. The planet is getting better. So like that's the underlying theme of the entire thing. It's not that like, look, humans are smart, capable. We can always reduce the amount of, impact that we're having on the environment as long as we do smart things. It's very like, oh, we done messed up and we need to go back.
Yeah, and even
it's very reactionary.
And like the step right before that, when they kind of just be very blunt about that kind of anti-human agenda of this, is they start talking about like how capitalism has co-opted the green movement, right? So, they started off that first hint when they were talking about the Koch brothers or whatever. They said the cancerous form of capitalism that runs the world is now trying to hide under the canopy of green or something along those lines. And then they start like dissecting some of these organizations and how they're all tied to like investments with like these big banks and these oil companies and these mining companies and, all of this stuff. And so one of the investment bankers is a guy named David Blood, and how he ran with Al Gore an investment fund where the guy, Jeff Gibbs, jokingly said was called Blood and Gore, which is just like David Blood and Al Gore working together on a fund. Like, you can't make that up. Blood and Gore? Like, are you serious? It's pretty wild.
He loved that. He loved that. And they also made hay out of the fact that Al Gore sold his like TV network to Al Jazeera using oil money.
Yes, right.
It's so good.
So then it goes through all of this and how it's like capitalism is using this green movement to basically just do more capitalism. And then it one of the last scenes is like this big Earth Day concert that they're having on there. And it's just like the most commercial thing you can imagine, but it's all under this idea of we're saving the planet with renewable energy or whatever. And at one point, one of the speakers comes out on stage and says, and this whole concert is being powered by solar panels. Yes. And then, so then they look over and then there's this like, obviously just like novelty solar panel arrays. There's like 15 of them, right?
Yeah.
And
would you like the quote? Do you have the quote?
I don't have the quote.
The guy who's backstage running the electronics, I wrote this down. If you're interested in skipping straight to this part, it's at 1 hour, 26 minutes and 30 seconds. You ain't running this whole thing on that, Jack.
Yeah, he's like, that's enough to run like a couple of toaster ovens. He's like,
yeah, he says that array right there could run a toaster. It uses 1,200 watts.
Yeah. So then they're like, well, what is running this concert? They're like, we're plugged into diesel generators.
Yeah.
Yep. You can't make this up, man. It's absolutely insane.
But it was
it's interesting. At one part in the show, they do allude to the fact that this is a religion and that this is just like the things that people choose to believe in on the environmental left side, and it's totally true.
I have that quote. I have that quoted directly.
Okay, why don't you read that, Jim?
Yeah.
Jim
so the director says the right has religion and they have a belief in infinite fossil fuels. Our side says it's okay because we're going to have solar panels and wind towers. And, it just alluded another thing that we talk about on this podcast a lot is that environmentalism is a substitute for religion to many hard leftists. And it really is. And to see a lefty basically admit it. Now, people on the right don't believe in infinite fossil fuels. I mean, I believe that we have, for by and large, it is infinite. We probably have 500 years of fossil fuels underneath our feet just here in the United States. So, to a certain extent, maybe it is infinite. But it was great to yes, but it was great to see them admit that environmentalism has become a religion, and maybe it's a come to Jesus moment that they're wrong too.
Yeah, I don't know.
What do you think, Justin? Do you think that they'll figure it out? Do you think they'll turn this ship around?
So I don't in a lot of ways, because I think. Let me say this: they might if they move on to something else. There might be some other cause that shifts the focus. It won't be that they've changed their mind on this. It will be that they've gone to something else and they've just ignored this, and they'll just pretend like this whole thing never happened. Yeah, essentially, that's that's exactly what they'll do. That's what they did with global cooling. That they've done this many times before on a variety of other issues. I think that what people need to understand on our side, I think what people on our side get wrong on this is that for most people, everybody on our side understands that a lot of this is virtue signaling for regular people, or not even virtue signaling. They genuinely want to believe that they're doing something good, right?
Yes.
Like they genuinely want to believe they're part of something positive. They're helping the planet, and they love that idea. They want to be a part of it. What I think we often miss is that then we love to point to these things and say, well, look, like this is all crap, and you're not really helping anyone and whatever. But that doesn't fill the void that's left in these people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. They still need something to believe in. They have to have something else. Then you got to give them something else.
Yep.
If you don't fill the void, then you know what you're left with? Because I've had lots of conversations with lots of different people on all sorts of issues, including this one. And whenever you get them to the point where you show them enough data that they actually start to acknowledge that maybe there's some truth to the things you're saying, this is the line that you'll inevitably always get to. Well, at least they're trying to do something.
Mm-hmm.
And you're not. See, you're not trying to do anything to save the planet. So maybe they're not saving the planet, but at least they're trying. You see, and that's the value. There's value in that to them. See, they would rather actually save the planet, but if they can't, then they'd at least try to. And so what our side needs to do on every issue is give them something positive that they can wrap themselves up in as well, so that they feel like they're part of something more than just, well, you guys are all wasting your time, and then that's it.
Yeah.
Right?
Your lives have been a complete lie, and you should probably...
Which is the thing that is completely missing in this documentary.
Right.
Just,
And that was leading me to my question. So it sounds like, I mean, you didn't directly answer the question I had originally, which was, what is their solution? And what it sounds like, if I'm gathering from this, it sounds like the solution is there really is no solution.
That's basically it.
And that we just have to have less people.
Livelihood. Yeah, exactly. Right. And basically, like what we're doing right now, you have the people that are saying, oh, well, look at all the unnecessary trips that have been avoided because people are locked in their houses because of COVID-19. Like, they basically want us to have like a very diminished standard of living in order to live more sustainably. So
right.
And limit population growth.
So in order to avoid future human misery, we need to implement mass current human misery. Like that's always the solution to this. So like this idea that we can somehow reduce our energy consumption and not have that end up like everybody's going to live on Little House on the Prairie just isn't going to work, but that's the solution. Little House on the Prairie.
Yeah, it requires a radical overhaul of everything. I mean, the words "radical overhaul" were used in the by one of the people that he talked to, and that's the way it is always with these eco-Marxists. You have to radically overhaul everything. You have to radically transform everything. The only thing this documentary left out, maybe it was because it was made too soon, was AOC. I would have loved to have seen him kind of confront AOC on her Green New Deal and on the other fantasies that are involved in that. But Justin, to answer your question, if you want to give the environmental left something to believe in after they watch this documentary, Planet of Humans, and get really disheartened, hey, how about this? How about preventing world poverty by allowing energy to be cheap so that people can pull themselves out of poverty and live a good life and protect the environment? Hey, how about this is actually, I think, what the filmmaker advocates is getting rid of this biomass stuff. We can't be using biomass for fuel because it's resulting in the clear cutting of forests and pollution and all these other things. So great. So there's two things somebody can put their heads around. Eradicate poverty by allowing the use of natural gas if you don't like coal, but cheap fossil fuels, and stop this clear cutting of forest for this virtue signaling pose of green energy via biomass.
Yeah. I mean, the problem with that, though, always gets back to, what about climate change? That's really going to harm people. Like, let's not worry about the fact that they're already in poverty and don't have access to like adequate healthcare and food. Because in the future, unless we reduce our CO2 emissions now, they're not going to have access to adequate healthcare and food. Like, that's the problem. But like they mentioned nuclear power exactly once in this documentary. And it's just they don't slam it, which to their credit, like they don't do that, but they do associate it with a wind company, which is funny because they're like trying to tangentially smear nuclear with wind, which I loved. Like, man,
Yeah, they mentioned
was
it
like
one
Christmas
time.
to me. Yeah.
Another expectation that I had when I was watching this after the first like 45 minutes is I thought that it was going to kind of go down the road of like one of those Michael Schellenberger talks that I've listened to in the past, where it's very similar. I'm very concerned about climate change. You should listen to me because I had all this, my hands and all this renewable energy stuff or whatever, until I looked under the hood and it was all terrible, right? Like it mirrors like the Michael Schellenberger path, except for Michael Schellenberger goes to nuclear energy as the solution to this, whereas this guy just goes to like, I don't know,
Horses.
like murdering each other and ourselves, I guess, and just trying to limit the population growth. But yeah, they don't talk about nuclear power at all in this. Not at all.
And they even say things like humans just think they can innovate their way out of everything, but you can't with this. It's like, well, actually, there's a really easy way for us to do that. You're just not talking about it.
Right. And we've innovated ourselves out of every problem for our entire existence. So why would it stop?
We won the Ice Age with spears and fire. So I feel like we're going to be okay. Like, when people talk about climate change being like this existential crisis, like humans aren't going to survive. I always like to say, like, hey, so 12,000 years ago, Wisconsin, like covered in a mile of ice. Like, how did people live there? Like,
the like environmentalists that are watching this, and they showed a bunch of kids doing 350.org activism type stuff, and similar to Jim
ripping bongs on Lansing's state capitol.
Similar to Jim, how he said he felt bad for some of these environmentalists. I started feeling bad for some of these kids. They're just being used as these little pawns for like, big green or whatever, they didn't know what they're actually fighting for or whatever. It just got really bleak. And I just thought like those kids watching this documentary and seeing that like all of that was for nothing. And this guy isn't offering any real solution. I was like, these people are going to kill themselves. Like it's that bleak.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because that is one of the biggest mistakes that the other side has made in all of this. And they've been doing it for a while, and they've been able to get away with it because people just continue to perpetuate this lie that you can solve this problem with wind and solar and whatever. It's this idea that, well, the planet is in such a dire strait that it's an existential threat to humanity. Like we're not going to make it. They've gone so far in that direction that it's not just like, well, we got to save dolphins and we got to save these animals caught in fishing nets. And, it's not good to have polluted rivers. No, they've gone so far that it's like humans aren't going to make it. Yeah. Like we're going to die. There was one article that was floating around for, I think it was last year when we were at CPAC, and I showed it to Jim actually when we were at CPAC. It was some study for like a week. It was in the news everywhere. It was in every big media publication. Some study came out that said that essentially in like 150 years or something like that, because of climate change, all the clouds are going to disappear and we're going to have an oven effect on the earth. And literally, it's going to be the entire Earth is going to be a desert because there'll be no clouds, no rain. Everything turns into a desert. That was floating around. Now, no, you don't ever hear anyone talk about that anymore, which I think is interesting. But they've made what's going to happen so extreme and so dire that when people realize there is no solution, it's like, what do? Yeah. It's like the asteroid's headed for Earth and we can't stop it. And now you're just like, well, I guess that's the end of life as we know it. I guess we're all going to die. And that's what Greta Thunberg is essentially doing. Is she's standing around
I haven't heard that name in
I know. She disappeared a little bit. But that's the thing, right? Like, why was she out there shaming all these people in the United Nations and why? Because she was saying, we're all going to die. That's what you keep telling us. And so why aren't we doing anything about it? We are going to die. Yeah. And they're all just kind of like, well, she's got a point. We're all going to die. We better do something. And then they don't do anything. And then it's just like that forever. So now, because they've gone so far in that direction, it is impossible to walk that back. Like impossible.
I had the same thought about Greta, like watching this. And I was like, I wish that I was watching it with her. Like, I would love to see what her reaction is to half of this stuff, right? And then I was thinking, like, after I finished it, I'm like, I want to try to find, like, you know, rebuttals to this from the people that were called out, the Bill McKibbins, the Sierra Clubs. Like, I want to see their reactions to this, right? So, granted, I didn't do a ton of research into this. I'm sure that there's some stuff that I didn't see, but I only found one article. And it was from Bill McKibbin. It was posted on 350.org. And it was titled Response, Planet of the Humans documentary. I was like, oh, great. I would love to see him try to, like, piece by piece explain why it's not as dire as all of this, why we should still do wind and solar, you know, all of that, right? No. It's about, like, 700 words explaining how he disavowed biomass like 3 years ago.
Right.
That's the entire article.
Gotta protect Bill McKibbin. Bill McKibbin's got to protect Bill McKibbin. Like that's
the response.
That's all it's exactly because that's the thing. There really is no answer to these objections that we've been talking about forever. There is no answer to them. The truth is the solution they've been peddling is not a solution, even if you accept the underlying premise. That's the problem. They actually have created a problem they can't solve. It is impossible to solve it. It's like giving somebody a puzzle that you literally cannot solve. It's impossible to solve. And then say, if you don't solve it, we're going to shoot you in the head. And then halfway through trying to solve the puzzle, they say, guess what? I hate to break it to you. There's no solution to the puzzle. What do? You just lament the fact that you're about to get shot in the head and there's nothing else you can do. That's what they've done here, essentially. Right. And so now all you can do if you're Bill McKibbin is protect your little fiefdom because you can't give that up. So you just keep protecting yourself. You can't give up on the movement because you're in too deep. And you just keep
it's like Walter White and Breaking Bad
forever. It's I mean, this thing is. It is really remarkable how far in they've gone to something that was so transparently never going to be fixed the way they said it was. It is remarkable.
We also have to address just kind of like our stance on this in general for the last like 5 minutes here, because I'm sure if anyone was, you know, found a free market organization or whatever that's talking about this documentary, want to see our worldview or whatever. We also have to kind of address what we think about climate change, right? So we just spent the last 55 minutes, talking about how this backs up all the stuff that we've talked about a million times. Wind and solar are terrible solutions to this problem, even if you see it as a problem. But just kind of addressing the climate change thing. So, I mean, just one thing I'll throw out there, and then I'll give it over to Isaac for him to talk on this, is like, if we're going to think that it's okay to spend hundreds of billions of dollars, trillions of dollars trying to do wind and solar for it to be absolutely terrible, let's spend a fraction of that money just dealing with whatever consequences there is of moderate warming in the future. Focus on adaptation versus mitigation. That would be a solid start. I know they didn't talk about nuclear energy, but if you're really concerned about this, check that out. It's been a lot of innovation since Chernobyl. But yeah, Isaac, do you want to speak on behalf of us too?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, if that is the case, if you are super concerned about CO2 emissions and climate change, the only alternative is nuclear power. That's it. I mean, that or large hydro, and you can't build that everywhere. So unless you're willing to do that, and let's face it, we're going to have to adapt regardless of what we do with our own CO2 emissions, because if there is, we know that the CO2 emissions that are man-made have some impact on the climate. The models have overestimated how much that would be. But, I think that there's a pretty okay argument that says, yeah, this will have an impact. But China's still burning way more coal than we are here in the United States. So greenhouse gases mix evenly in the atmosphere. And that means as India and China industrialize, we're going to have an impact from them that isn't going to go away just because we've reduced our own CO2 emissions. Mm-hmm. That's not how this works. It's not like if you're a good little boy or girl, you get to go to heaven if you do the right things. But I think that's how environmentalists see this. They pretend that all we need to do is show leadership in our state, and then we can show everyone else. It's like, no, that's.
Oh, Isaac was just
emissions, as you say you are, and they're going to have, as if you're right, let's just say you're right, with the dire consequences for not doing it, then you're going to have mitigation strategies in place regardless of what you do, because the rest of the world isn't going to reduce their emissions because you are. So that's it.
All right, great. You were just starting to cut out a little bit, so I'm glad you wrapped up when you did. Jim, final words on all of this, and then we'll have to sign off for the week.
Highly recommend watching this movie, A Planet of Humans. Is that what it's called? A Planet of Humans? The Planet of Humans.
Planet of the Humans.
Planet of the Humans. Okay. Oh, I get it.
Planet of the Humans, like Planet of the Apes.
Yeah. I got it. Yeah. Wow. I didn't catch that until just now. But
you just got that?
Yeah, I just got it.
That long.
Yeah.
Didn't that movie come out when you were like in grade school or something?
No, I was in my 20s. I was in my 20s.
The Charlton Heston version.
That's right. No, but so I know I just highly recommend it, and it's like I said, I think it is somebody who got red pilled, at least from the left, from his own movement that he's grown up in his entire life. And if you are on our side of this argument, unless you have a heart of stone, you'll have a little bit of empathy for the people in this documentary, plus the filmmaker, because he does say at one point, what if all of these environmental leaders are misguided and they're leading us all off the cliff? Even though he's anti-capitalist, he's a Marxist in his worldview. You got to feel a little bit of empathy for somebody whose eyes have finally been opened, and that the environmental movement is a sham, and you've all been lied to, and they've created a religion. It's like the televangelists of the 1980s, like Jim and Tammy Faye Baker. They're fooling their audience, and they've gotten away with this for a long time. And the real takeaway: stick around for the closing credits, because they have some updates on things that are happening in the closing credits, including the fact that Al Gore, who there's a scene where he's laughing with Richard Branson, who has dedicated all this money to green energy, and he says, the CBS News Harry Smith interviewer asks Richard Branson, is Al Gore is he a prophet? And Richard Branson jokes, well, how do you spell profit? They all laugh, profit with an F, of course. And so it's hilarious that this guy is completely disillusioned because he's a Marxist. He doesn't like anybody making a profit, but he realizes what a scam it is. And in the closing credits, they mention that Gore and Blood and Gore have opened up a new $1 billion venture for clean energy in the Cayman Islands. So, it's all a scam.
Yeah. Two things real quick, and then we'll sign off here. Richard Branson, I haven't looked into him too much or whatever, but just based on like the two small clips that they show of him in this documentary, I am going to say that Richard Branson is the Joe Exotic of world travel, by the way. And then the other thing is, I am actually a little bit more scared of people with the mindset of this Jeff Gibbs, even though I agreed with him on the first 45 minutes of this documentary or whatever. I'm more scared of him and his worldview than the AOCs of the world, because he thinks that capitalism is terrible. There's no way that we can sustain this type of population. And the anti-human agenda is basically what needs to happen. No, he compares the environmentalists, like the modern day AOC types or whatever, thinking that we can sustain this type of world. We just have to do it with green energy. So but that is probably a whole nother topic. Maybe Justin and I will do a companion piece to this, a stopping socialism video or something like that. But gentlemen, that's all. We're already going long here. So Justin, where can people go to stay up to date with you?
At Justin T. Haskins on Facebook and Twitter.
Jim, where can the people find you?
At Jay Lakely on Twitter, at Heartland Inst on Twitter, and also heartland.org.
Isaac Orr, same question.
At Justin T. Haskins on Facebook and Twitter.
Nice. Look for the big, beautiful blue check mark.
That's right.
Thank you all for tuning in, and we will talk to you next week.